안녕하세요. 꾸준한 영어 테드쌤입니다. 오늘은 낭독을 하기 전에 가을밤에 어울리는 시를 하나 읽어보고 시작하려고 합니다. 오늘 읽을 시는 If You Forget Me 라고 하는 파블로 네루다라고 하는 칠레 시인이 쓴 작품을 읽어보려고 합니다. 파블로 네루다는 1971년에 노벨 문학상을 수상한 칠레의 정치가이자 시인이면서 전 세계 사람들에게 가장 많이 사랑받는 시인 중 한 명이라고 합니다. 자, 그분이 쓴 If You Forget Me 한번 읽어보도록 하겠습니다. 원문은 나중에 제가 설명하는 부분에 올려놓도록 하겠습니다. If you forget me, I want you to know one thing. You know how this is. If I look at the crystal moon, at the red branch of the slow autumn at my window, if I touch near the fire the impalpable ash or the wrinkled body of the log, everything carries me to you, as if everything that exists, aromas, light, metals, were little boats that sail toward those isles of yours that waits for me. Well now, if little by little you stop loving me, I shall stop loving you little by little. If suddenly you forget me, do not look for me, for I shall already have forgotten you. If you think it long and mad, the wind of banners that passes through my life, and you decide to leave me at the shore of the heart where I have lived, remember that on that day, at that hour, I shall lift my arms, and my roots will set off to seek another land. But if each day, each hour, you feel that you are destined for me with an implacable sweetness, if each day a flower climbs up to your lips to seek me, oh my love, oh my own, in me all that fire is repeated. In me nothing is extinguished or forgotten. My love feeds on your love, beloved, and as long as you live it will be in your arms without leaving mine. By Pablo Neruda. 어우, 시 너무 좋지 않습니까? 예, 사랑하는 사람에게 바치는 어떤 고백과 같은 시인데 단호함까지도 느껴지는데 이 단호함이 오히려 더 자신이 연인을 사랑한다는 마음을 표현한 것 같습니다. 물론 여러 가지 해석이 있을 수 있겠지만 굉장히 강하고 또 굉장히 아름다운 사랑을 표현한 시이고 인생과도 비교할 수 있는 그런 멋진 시라고 생각합니다. 나름 최선을 다해서 읽어보았습니다. 최대한 감정을 훼손하지 않고 읽으려고 했는데 부끄럽네요. 그래도 즐겁게 감상하시길 바랍니다. 자, 이제 저는 본연의 자세로 돌아가서 낭독을 시작해 보도록 하겠습니다. 오늘은 챕터 2를 물론 반복해서 읽을 거지만 지금까지 읽었던 Editor's Note, 챕터 1, 챕터 2까지 다시 한번 연속해서 읽어볼 수 있도록 하겠습니다. 감성에 젖어있던 시 때문에 풍성해진 감정이 조금 더 이제 유쾌하고 즐거운 아동도서로 돌아와야 되기 때문에 밝아져야 되겠지만 그래도 또 열심히 읽어보도록 하겠습니다. Vernacular, Editor's Note. The book you are about to read was brought to my attention in a most unusual way. One Friday afternoon, just before closing time, I heard a scratching sound at the front door of my office. When I opened the door, there before me stood a sad-eyed, droop-eared dog carrying a large, plain envelope in his mouth. He dropped it in at my feet, gave me a soulful glance, and with great, quiet dignity, sauntered away. Inside the envelope was the manuscript of the book you now hold in your hands, together with this letter. Gentlemen, the enclosed story is true. It happened in this very town, to me and the family with whom I reside. I have changed the names of the family in order to protect them. But in all other respects, everything you will read here is factual. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Harold. I come to writing purely by chance. My full-time occupation is dog. I live with Mr. and Mrs. X, called here the Monroes, and their two sons, Toby aged 8 and Pete aged 10. Also sharing our home is a cat named Chester, whom I am pleased to call my friend. We were a typical American family, and still are, though the events related in my story have, of course, had their effect on our lives. I hope you will find this tale of sufficient interest to yourself and your readers to warrant its publication. Sincerely, Harold X. Bunnicula, a rabbit tale of mystery. Chapter 1. The Arrival. I shall never forget the first time I laid these now tired old eyes on our visitor. I had been left home by the family with the admonition to take care of the house until they returned. That's something they always say to me when they go out. Take care of the house, Harold. You are the watchdog. I think it's their way of making up for not taking me with them, as if I wanted to go anyway. You can't lie down at the movies and still see the screen, and the people think you are being impolite if you fall asleep and start to snore, or scratch yourself in public. No, thank you. I'd rather be stretched out on my favorite rag in front of a nice, whistling radiator. But I digress. I was talking about the first night. Well, it was cold. The rain was pelting the windows, the wind was howling, and it felt pretty good to be indoors. I was lying on the rug with my head on my paws, just staring absently at the front door. My friend Chester was curled up on the brown velvet armchair, which years ago he'd staked out as his own. I saw that once again he'd covered the whole seat with his cat hair, and I chuckled to myself, picturing the scene tomorrow. Next to grasshoppers, there is nothing that frightens Chester more than the vacuum cleaner. In the midst of this reverie, I heard a car pull into the driveway. I did not even bother to get up and see who it was. I knew it had to be my family, the Monroes, since it was just about time for the movie to be over. After a moment, the front door flew open. There they stood in the doorway, Toby and Pete, and Mom and Dad Monroe. There was a flash of lightning, and in its glare, I noticed that Mr. Monroe was carrying a little bundle, a bundle with tiny glistening eyes. Pete and Toby bounded into the room, both talking at the top of their lungs. Toby shouted, "Put him over here, Dad!" "Take your boots off, you're soaking wet," replied his mother, somewhat calmly, I thought, under the circumstances. "But, Mom, what about—" "First, stop dropping on the carpet." "Would somebody like to take this?" asked Mr. Monroe, indicating the bundle with the eyes. "I'd like to remove my coat." "I will," Pete yelled. "No, I will," said Toby. "I found him." "You will drop him." "I will not." "You will too." Mom, Pete punched me. I'll take him, said Mrs. Monroe. Take off your coat this minute. But she became so involved in helping the boys out of their coats that she didn't take him at all. My tranquil evening had been destroyed, and no one had even said hello to me. I whimpered to remind them that I was there. Harold, cried Toby, guess what happened to me? And then, all over again, everyone started talking at once. At this point, I feel I must explain something. In our family, everyone treats everyone else with great respect for his or her intelligence. That goes for the animals as well as the people. Everything that happens to them is explained to us. It's never been just a good boy, Harold, or use the little box, Chester, at our house. Oh no, with us it's, hey, Harold, Dad got a raise and now we are in a higher tax bracket. Or, come, sit on the bed, Chester, and I want to this Wild Kingdom show. Maybe you will see a relative. Which shows just how thoughtful they are. But after all, Mr. Monroe is a college professor and Mrs. Monroe is a lawyer, so we think of it as a rather special household. And we are, therefore, rather special pets. So it wasn't at all surprising to me that they took the time to explain the strange circumstances surrounding the arrival of the little bundle with those glistening eyes now among us. It seems that they had arrived at the theater late, and rather than trip over the feet of the audience already seated, they decided to sit in the last row, which was empty. They tiptoed in and sat down very quietly, so they wouldn't disturb anyone. Suddenly, Toby, who's the little one, sprang up from his chair and squealed that he had sat on something. Mr. Munro told him to stop making a fuss and move to another seat. But in an unusual display of independence, Toby said he wanted to see just what it was he had sat on. An usher came over to their row to shush them, and Mr. Munro borrowed his flashlight. What they found on Toby's chair was a little blanket bundle that was now sitting on Mr. Munro's lap. They now unwrapped the blanket, and there in the center was a tiny black and white rabbit, sitting in a shoe box filled with dirt. A piece of paper had been tied to his neck with a ribbon. There were words on the paper, but the Monroes were unable to decipher them because they were in a totally unfamiliar language. I moved closer for a better look. Now, most people might call me a Mongolo, but I have some pretty fancy bloodlines running through these veins, and the Russian wolfhound happens to be one of them. Because my family got around a lot, I was able to recognize the language as an obscure dialect of the Carpathian Mountain region. Roughly translated, it read, "Take good care of my baby." But I couldn't tell if it was a note from a bereaved mother or a piece of Romanian sheet music. The little guy was shivering from fear and cold. It was decided that Mr. Monroe and the boys would make a house for him out of an old crate and some heavy-duty wire mesh from the garage. For the night, the boys would make a bed for him in the shoebox. Toby and Pete ran outside to find the crate, and Mrs. Monroe went to the kitchen to get him some milk and lettuce. Mr. Monroe sat down, a dazed expression in his eyes, as if he were wondering how he came to be sitting in his own living room in a wet raincoat with a strange bunny on his lap. I signaled to Chester, and the two of us casually moseyed over to a corner of the room. We looked at each other. "Well, what do you think?" I asked. "I don't think rabbits like milk," he answered. Chester and I were unable to continue our conversation because a deafening crash commanded our attention. Pete yelled from the hallway, "Ma, Toby broke the rabbit's house." "I didn't. I just dropped it. Pete won't let me carry it." "It's too big, Toby's too little." "I'm not. You're two." "Okay, fellas." Mrs. Munner called out as she entered with the milk and lettuce. Let's try to get it in here with as little hysteria as possible, please. Chester turned to me and said under his breath, That lettuce looks repulsive, but if there's any milk left, I get it. I certainly wasn't going to argue with him. I'm a waterman myself. At that moment, the crate arrived, barely standing the strain of being pulled in two directions at once. Ma, Toby says he's gonna keep the rabbit in his room. That's not fair. Harold sleeps in his room. Only sometimes, I thought. When I know he's got a wrapped over ham sandwich in his drawer. Toby's a nice kid, don't get me wrong. But it doesn't hurt that he shared his stash with me. It was, after all, at one of those late-night parties in Toby's room that I first developed my taste for chocolate cake. And Toby, noting my preference, has kept me in chocolate cake ever since. Pete, on the other hand, doesn't believe in sharing, and the only time I tried to sleep on his bed, he rolled over on me and pinned me by my ears so that I couldn't move for the rest of the night. I had a crick in my neck for days. But he's mine, Toby said. I found him. You sat on him, you mean. I found him, and he's sleeping in my room. You can keep Smelly Old Harold in your room, and Chester too, if you want to, but I'm gonna keep the rabbit in mine. Smelly Old Harold. I would have bitten his ankle. But I knew he hadn't changed his socks for a week. Smelly indeed. Mr. Murner spoke up. I think the best place for the rabbit is right here in the living room on that table by the window. It's light there, and he will get lots of fresh air. Peter's taller than I am, Toby cried. He will be able to see the rabbit better. Too bad, Squirt. Okay, said Mrs. Munner through clenched teeth. Let's bring him to bed and make him comfortable, and then we can all get some sleep. Why? Pete asked. I don't want to go to sleep. Mrs. Munner smiled a little too sweetly at Pete. Look, Ma, said Toby. He's not drinking his milk. Chester nudged me in the ribs. Didn't I tell you? He asked. Excuse me while I make myself available. Hey, said Toby, we gotta name him. Can't that wait until tomorrow? Asked Mr. Munro. The boys shouted in unison. No, he has to have a name right now. I have to say, I agreed with them. It took them 3 days to name me, and those were the 3 most anxious days of my life. I couldn't sleep at all, worrying that they were really going to call me Fluffy, as Mrs. Murner had suggested. Well, all right, sighed Mrs. Murner. What about, say, Bun Bun? Uh-oh, there she goes again, I thought. Where did she get them? Yuck, we all said. Well, then, how about Fluffy? She offered hopefully. Peter looked at his mother and smiled. You never give up, do you, Ma? Meanwhile, Chester, who had also been named Fluffy for a short time, was rubbing against Mrs. Munro's ankles and purring loudly. No, Chester, not now, she said, pushing him aside. He wants to help us name him, don't you, Chester? Toby asked, as he scooped him up into his arms. Chester shot me a look. I could tell this was not what he had in mind. Come on, Harold, Toby called. You've got to help with the name, too. I joined the family, and the serious thinking began. We all peered into the box. It was the first time I had really seen him. So this is a rabbit, I thought. He sort of looks like a Chester, only he's got longer ears and a shorter tail, and a motor in his nose. Well, said Pete, after a moment, since we found him at the movies, why don't we call him Mr. Johnson? There was a moment of silence. Who's Mr. Johnson? Asked Toby. The guy who owns the movie theater, Pete answered. No one seemed to like the idea. How about Prince? Said Mr. Monroe. Dad, said Toby, Are you kidding? Well, I had a dog named Prince once, he replied lamely. Prince, I thought. That's a silly name for a dog. We found him at a Dracula movie. Let's call him Dracula, Toby said. That's a stupid name, said Pete. No, it's not, and anyway, I found him, so I should get to name him. Mom, you're not gonna let him name him, are you? That's favoritism, and I'll be traumatized if you do. Mrs. Murnau looked in wonder at Pete. Please, Mom, please, Dad, let's name him Dracula, cried Toby. Please, please, please. And with each please, he squeezed the chest a little harder. Mrs. Murnau picked up the bowl of milk and moved toward the kitchen. Chester followed her every movement with his eyes, which now seemed to be popping out of his head. When she reached the kitchen door, she turned back and said, Let's not have any more arguments. We'll compromise. He's a bunny, and we found him at a Dracula movie, so we'll call him Bunnicula. Bunnicula. That should make everybody happy, including me. What about me? Muttered Chester. I won't be happy until she puts down the milk. Well, guys, is that okay with you? She asked. Toby and Pete looked at one another, and then at the rabbit. A smile grew on Toby's face. Yeah, Ma, I think that name is just right. Pete shrugged. It's okay, but I get to feed him. Okay, I'm gonna put the milk back in the fridge. Maybe he will drink it tomorrow. What about Chester? Toby said, dropping the frantic cat to the floor. Maybe he would like it. Chester made a beeline for Mrs. Murnau and looked up at her plaintively. Oh, Chester doesn't want any more milk, do you, Chester? You've already had your milk today. She reached down, patted Chester on his head, and walked into the kitchen. Chester didn't move. Okay, bedtime, said Mr. Murnau. Good night, Bunnicula, Toby said. Good night, Count Bunnicula, Pete said sarcastically, in what I took to be his attempt at a Transylvanian accent. I may be wrong, but I thought I saw a flicker of movement from the cage. Good night, Harold. Good night, Chester. I licked Toby good night. Good night, Smelly Harold. Good night, dumb Chester. I drooled on Peter's foot. Mom, Harold drooled on my foot. Good night, Pete, Mrs. Murnau said with a great finality as she came back into the living room, and then more calmly, Good night, Harold. Good night, Chester. Mr. and Mrs. Murnau went up the stairs together. You know, dear, Mr. Murnau said, that was very clever, Bunnicula. I could never have thought of a name like that. I don't know, Robert. She smiled as she put her arm through his. I think Prince is a lovely name, too. The room was quiet. Chester was still sitting by the closed kitchen door in a state of shock. Slowly, he turned to me. I wish they had named him Fluffy, was all he said. Chapter 2. Music in the Night. I feel at this time there are a few things you should know about Chester. He's not your ordinary cat, but then I'm not your ordinary dog, since an ordinary dog wouldn't be writing this book, would he? Chester came into the house several years ago as a birthday gift for Mr. Murnau, along with 2 volumes of G.K. Chesterton, hence the name Chester, and a first edition of Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities. As a result of this introduction to literature, and given the fact that Mr. Murnau is an English professor, Chester developed a taste of reading early in life. I, on the other hand, have developed a taste for books. I found Jonathan Livingston Seagull particularly delicious. From Chester's kittenhood on, Mr. Murnau has used him as a sounding board for all his student lectures. If Chester doesn't fall asleep when Mr. Murnau is talking, the lecture can be counted a success. Every night, when the family is sleeping, Chester goes to the bookshelf, selects his midnight reading, and curls up on his favorite chair, He especially likes mystery stories and the tales of horror and the supernatural. As a result, he has developed a very vivid imagination. I'm telling you this because I think it's important for you to know something of Chester's background before I relate to you the story of the event following the arrival of Bunnicula into our home. Let me begin with that first night. It seems that after I went to sleep, Chester, still stewing over the lost milk, settled down with his latest book and attempted to ignore the rumbling in his stomach. The room was dark and quiet. This did not prevent his reading, of course, since, as you know, cats can see in the dark. A shaft of moonlight fell across the rabbit's cage and spilled onto the floor below. The wind and the rain had stopped, and as Chester read Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher, he became increasingly aware of the eerie stillness that had taken their place. As Chester tells it, he suddenly felt compelled to look at the rabbit. I don't know what came over me, he said to me the next morning, but a cold chill ran down my spine. The little bunny had begun to move for the first time since he had been put in his cage. He lifted his tiny nose and inhaled deeply, as if gathering sustenance from the moonlight. He slicked his ears back close to his body, and for the first time, Chester said, I noticed the peculiar marking on his forehead. What had seemed an ordinary black spot between his ears took on a strange V-shape, which connected with the big black patch that covered his back and each side of his neck. It looked as if he was wearing a coat. No, more like a cape than a coat. Through the silence had drifted the strains of a remote and exotic music. I could have sworn it was a gypsy violin, Chester told me. I thought perhaps a caravan was passing by, so I ran to the window. I remembered my mother telling me something about the caravans when I was a puppy, but for the life of me, I couldn't remember what. What's a caravan? I asked, feeling a little, feeling a little stupid. A caravan is a band of gypsies traveling through the forest in their wagons, Chester answered. Oh, yes. It was coming back to me now. Station wagons? No, covered wagons. The gypsies travel all through the land, setting up camps around great bonfires, doing magical tricks, and sometimes, if you cross their palms with a piece of silver, they will tell your fortune. You mean if I gave them a fork, they'd tell my fortune? I asked, breathlessly. Chester looked at me with disdain. Save your silverware, he said. It wasn't a caravan after all. I was disappointed. What was it? I asked. Chester explained that when he looked out the window, he saw Professor Micklewhite, our next-door neighbor, playing the violin in his living room. He listened for a few moments to the haunting melody and sighed with relief. I've really got to stop reading these horror stories late at night, he thought. It's beginning to affect my mind. He yawned and turned to go back to his chair and get some sleep. As he turned, however, he was startled by what he saw. There in the moonlight, as the music filtered through the air, sat the bunny, his eyes intense and staring, an unearthly aura about them. Now, this is the part you won't believe, Chester said to me. But as I watched, his lips parted in a hideous smile, and where a rabbit's buck teeth should have been, the little pointed fangs glistened. I wasn't sure what to make of Chester's story, but the way he told it set my hair on end. 네, 처음부터 오늘 지금까지 연습하고 있는 챕터 2까지 한번 읽어보았습니다. 오늘은 굉장히 조그맣게 짧은 시간이라도 눈을 붙이고 나와서 그런지 조금 덜 피곤하고 이런데 굉장히 많이 저 스스로도 야 이거 꽤 괜찮은데 라는 낭독이 되는 것 같습니다. 이 기분을 살려서 챕터 2를 몇 번 더 읽은 다음에 낭독을 마치도록 하겠습니다. 네. Chapter 2 Music in the Night. I feel at this time there are a few things you should know about Chester. He is not your ordinary cat, but then I'm not your ordinary dog, since an ordinary dog wouldn't be writing this book, would he? Chester came into the house several years ago as a birthday gift for Mr. Monroe, along with 2 volumes of G.K. Chesterton, hence the name Chester, and a first edition of Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities. As a result of this introduction to literature, and given the fact that Mr. Monroe is an English professor, Chester developed a taste of reading early in life. I, on the other hand, have developed a taste for books. I found Jonathan Livingston Seagull particularly delicious. From Chester's kittenhood on, Mr. Monroe has used him as a sounding board for all his students' lectures. If Chester doesn't fall asleep when Mr. Monroe is talking, the lecture can be counted a success. Every night, when the family is sleeping, Chester goes to the bookshelf, selects his midnight reading, and curls up on his favorite chair. He especially likes mystery stories and the tales of horror and the supernatural as a result. He has developed a very vivid imagination. I'm telling you this because I think it's important for you to know something of Chester's background before I relate to you the story of the events following the arrival of Bunnicula into our home. Let me begin with that first night. It seems that after I went to sleep, Chester, still stewing over the lost milk, settled down with his latest book and attempted to ignore the rumbling in his stomach. The room was dark and quiet. This did not prevent his reading, of course, since, as you know, cats can see in the dark. A shaft of moonlight fell across the rabbit's cage and spilled onto the floor below. The wind and the rain had stopped, and as Chester read Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher, he became increasingly aware of the eerie stillness that had taken their place. As Chester tells it, he suddenly felt compelled to look at the rabbit. I don't know what came over me, he said to me the next morning, but a cold chill ran down my spine. The little bunny had begun to move for the first time since he had been put in his cage. He lifted his tiny nose and inhaled deeply, as if gathering sustenance from the moonlight. He slicked his ears back close to his body, and for the first time, Chester said, I noticed the peculiar marking on his forehead. What had seemed an ordinary black spot between his ears took on a strange V-shape, which connected with the big black patch that covered his back and each side of his neck. It looked as if he was wearing a coat. No, more like a cape than a coat. Through the silence had drifted the strains of remote and exotic music. I could have sworn it was a gypsy violin. Chester told me. I thought perhaps a caravan was passing by, so I ran to the window. I remembered my mother telling me something about caravans when I was a puppy, but for the life of me, I couldn't remember what. What's a caravan? I asked, feeling a little stupid. A caravan is a band of gypsies traveling through the forest in their wagons. Chester answered. Oh, yes. It was coming back to me now. Station wagons? No, covered wagons. The gypsies travel all through the land, setting up camps around great bonfires, doing magical tricks, and sometimes, if you cross their palms with a piece of silver, they will tell your fortune. You mean if I gave them a fork, they'd tell my fortune? I asked, breathlessly. Chester looked at me with disdain. Save your silverware, he said. It wasn't a caravan at all. After all, I was disappointed. What was it? I asked. Chester explained that when he looked out the window, he saw Professor Micklewhite, our next-door neighbor, playing the violin in his living room. He listened for a few moments to the haunting melody and sighed with relief. I've really got to stop reading these horror stories late at night, he thought. It's beginning to affect my mind. He yawned and turned to go back to his chair and to get some sleep. As he turned, however, he was startled by what he saw. There in the moonlight, as the music filtered through the air, sat the bunny, his eyes intense and staring an unearthly aura above them. Now this is the part you won't believe, Chester said to me. But as I watched it, his lips parted in a hideous smile, and where a rabbit's buck teeth should have been, two little pointed fangs glistened. I wasn't sure what to make of Chester's story, but the way he told it set my hair on end. Chapter 2. Music in the Night. I feel at this time there are a few things you should know about Chester. He's not your ordinary cat, but then I'm not your ordinary dog, since an ordinary dog wouldn't be writing this book, would he? Chester came into the house several years ago as a birthday gift for Mr. Monroe, along with the 2 volumes of G.K. Chesterton, hence the name Chester, and a first edition of Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities. As a result of this introduction to literature, and given the fact that Mr. Monroe is an English professor, Chester developed a taste of reading early in life. I, on the other hand, have developed a taste for books. I found Jonathan Livingston Seagull particularly delicious. From Chester's kittenhood on, Mr. Monroe has used him as a sounding board for all his students' lectures. If Chester doesn't fall asleep when Mr. Monroe is talking, the lecture can be counted a success. Every night, when the family is sleeping, Chester goes to the bookshelf, selects his midnight reading, and curls up on his favorite chair. He especially likes mystery stories and the tales of horror and the supernatural. As a result, he has developed a very vivid imagination. I'm telling you this because I think it's important for you to know something about Chester. Uh, some, uh, I think it's important for you to know something of Chester's background. Before I related to you the story of the event following the arrival of Bunnicula into our home, let me begin with that first night. It seems that after I went to sleep, Chester, still stewing over the lost milk, settled down with the latest book and attempted to ignore the rumbling in his stomach. The room was dark and quiet. This did not prevent his reading, of course, since, as you know, cats can see in the dark. A shaft of moonlight fell across the rabbit cage and spilled onto the floor below. The wind and the rain had stopped, and as Chester read Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher, he became increasingly aware of the eerie stillness that had taken their place. As Chester tells it, he suddenly felt compelled to look at the rabbit. I don't know what came over me, he said to me the next morning, but a cold chill ran down my spine. The little bunny had begun to move for the first time since he had been put in his cage. He lifted his tiny nose and inhaled deeply, as if gathering sustenance from the moonlight. He slicked his ears back close to his body, and for the first time, Chester said, I noticed the peculiar marking on his forehead. What had seemed to ordinary black spot between his ears took on a strange V-shape, which connected with the big black patch that covered his back and each side of his neck. It looked as if he was wearing a coat. No, more like a cape than a coat. Through the silence had drifted the strains of a remote and exotic music. I could have sworn it was a gypsy violin. Chester told me. I thought perhaps a caravan was passing by, so I ran to the window. I remembered my mother telling me something about the caravans when I was a puppy, but for the life of me, I couldn't remember what. What's a caravan? I asked, feeling a little stupid. A caravan is a band of gypsies traveling through the forest in their wagons, Chester answered. Oh, yes, it was coming back to me now. Station wagons? No, covered wagons. The gypsies travel all through the land, setting up camps around great bonfires, doing magical tricks, and sometimes, if you cross their palms with a piece of silver, they will tell your fortune. You mean if I gave them a pork, they'd tell my fortune? I asked breathlessly. Chester looked at me with disdain. Save your silverware, he said. It wasn't a caravan after all. I was disappointed. What was it? I asked. Chester explained that when he looked out the window, he saw Professor Micklewhite, our next-door neighbor, playing the violin in his living room. He listened for a few moments to the haunting melody and sighed with relief. I've really got to stop reading these horror stories late at night, he thought. It's beginning to affect my mind. He yawned and turned to go back to his chair and get some sleep. As he turned, however, he was startled by what he saw. There in the moonlight, as the music filtered through the air, sat the bunny, his eyes intense and staring, an unearthly aura about them. Now this is the part you won't believe, Chester said to me. But as I watched, his lips parted in a hideous smile, and where a rabbit's buck teeth should have been, two little pointed fangs glistened. I wasn't sure what to make of Chester's story, but the way he told it set my hair on end.